We are going to be starting our unit on poetry. And so if you're in person, you should have a page that looks like this that we glued in your interactive notebook. And if you're online, you are going to be taking your notes on this document. So anywhere that there's a yellow highlight here is where you need to fill in a word or a phrase or an example according to the screencast that you watch. Now, we will be doing the first part together. This screencast is really for people who were absent and didn't participate in class. But we're going to talk today just about prose and poetry. And then over the course of the next week, you'll watch one screencast about form, sound, imagery, figurative language, and speaker. And this is where you'll take notes if you're online. And this is what you'll open up to in your interactive notebook if you're in person. Okay? Now, a lot of times when we start talking about poetry, I get lots of moans and groans, and I would say that when I was your age, I probably felt pretty similar to how you did. And I think that that was probably more as a result of not having a good understanding of poetry. And so since I didn't understand poetry, it was a lot harder, and it was not something that I looked forward to doing. So my hope is that as we go through this poetry unit, you'll get a better understanding of what poetry is and enjoy it a little bit more, or at least not have those negative feelings associated with poetry. One of the things we will not be doing, I may give you the option to do it, but I will not force or grade you on it, is writing poetry. And I think that this quote here encompasses how I feel about writing poetry. It says, "A man doesn't go in search of a poem, the poem goes in search of him." I feel like poetry is something you have to be kind of inspired to write, unless you really like it. Again, with anything, if you practice at anything, it's going to be a lot easier. But that is not going to be the focus of what we're going to be doing in class. We're really going to be looking at the meaning behind poems and analyzing poetry. So in order to understand what poetry is, we first have to know the difference between prose and poetry. So prose is written or spoken language in its ordinary form. It's what we read every day in novels, in articles on the internet, your Achieve articles. It's written with sentences that are formulated and grouped together into paragraphs. And that's really what we read most of the time. Poetry is a completely separate genre of literature, and it was written by the author to express an idea or feeling and sometimes to tell a story. We're going to read a really fun narrative poem a little bit closer to baseball season that expresses a story in a fun way. Now, what makes poetry very different is that it's written with lines. We don't call them sentences, we call them lines, because what you're going to notice as we go through poetry is it's probably not complete sentences at all. There might just be one word on a line, or maybe just a prepositional phrase on a line, or maybe it's a run-on sentence. So we don't really think about it in terms of sentences. And that might be what you like about poetry, is we're not going to really have the same rules of grammar and punctuation that we worry about when we're doing prose. And when those lines get grouped together, instead of paragraphs, we call them stanzas. So if we look at an example here, this paragraph is written in a series of sentences, a complete sentence, and then another sentence, and then another sentence, built together to develop an entire paragraph about this one topic, the perfect ice cream sundae. You can tell that it's indented. When you got to the period, you just continued on and kept writing. You didn't hit enter after each line, and it makes a paragraph. Poetry is different. You can see that this is not indented. It really looks like it's centered along the middle of the page. There's no period at the end of this line. The period doesn't actually come all the way down until this fourth line over here. And so we don't think of this as a sentence. We think of this poem having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 separate lines. And within those lines, put together, they make up one stanza. Okay, so that's how we're going to be discussing poetry. Lines and stanzas. Now, as we go through looking at poems, these are the 5 elements that we're going to be analyzing. And then hopefully by the time we've gone through and analyzed these 5 elements, you have a better understanding of that poem. We're going to look at its form, any sound in the poem, imagery, figurative language, and the speaker of the poem. And that's it for our introduction today. So tomorrow, you'll be taking notes on form and then every day we'll continue on with a new element.